Good afternoon. I'll back off that mic. I think somebody turned my volume up. I am calling the April 3rd meeting of
You mute that.
ENRAC to order at this time, and we will proceed, please, with roll call. And can someone turn my volume down just a little? This is freaking me out. Thank you.
Okay, hang on one sec.
While they're checking that out, we've been informed that member Donna Brosmer would like to join by remote. I don't know if she's logged in yet, but if and when she does, someone will need to move to allow her participation.
Okay, there's a little reverb over here, but I'll go ahead. So Melissa Lammers. Here. Jessica Gao. Wendy Anderson. Here. Tyler Malmberg.
Here.
Sarah Lee Morrissey. Bob Fitzsimmons. John Hoblick. Jack Surratt.
Here.
Bliss Jameson. Bill Lights.
Here.
Bernie LaFease. Alex Zielinski.
Here.
Suzanne Schreiber. And then, like Melissa said, Donna has indicated that she wants to participate remotely, although I don't think she has yet logged into the Teams meeting. But if you wanted to go ahead and vote to allow her to participate, you could do that now. And then when she logs in, she'd be set.
Yeah, I move that we allow her in.
All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, Donna will be allowed to participate remotely if and when she logs in. And by my count, we have quorum, correct?
We have quorum. If anybody has to leave early and no one else comes, then you no longer have a physical quorum. So that would be the end of the meeting at that point. Right? We have 8 people physically here. If they lose a quorum, yes.
So nobody's going anywhere. And we have a visitor today. I don't usually ask this, but will the visitor be asking to speak?
She might have to speak.
Yay.
Oh, Jessica. So I'll just start with maybe some introductions of people that you haven't met yet.
Tad Casebeer, County Engineer. Over that, that's Storm Kazmierzak, the Assistant County Engineer.
This is Morgan Swank. She is one of the new attorneys with the county, and she will eventually be taking this board over for me because I have frequent scheduling conflicts. So we're glad to have her on.
And Samantha's back. And just one other announcement real quick before we get onto the business. I have a couple of different conflicts today. Oh, Sarah Lee's here. Excellent. So I will be leaving shortly after approval of minutes. Samantha will be here from environmental for the rest of the meeting. So I do ask that if you speak into the microphones because I'll be listening later and I want to hear everything everybody says.
All right, moving right along, now that we have +2 on our quorum, has everyone read the February 7th and the March 6th minutes that were distributed? Would someone entertain making a motion moving to approve February 7th?
I'll make a motion, but need some changes, I think.
And those changes are?
On line 28 through 30. I think that's 3 thoughts mashed into one. And they don't quite make sense. It's Mr. Abramson reported that the 25-foot diameter, this is about tortoises, is site dependent. Relocation is up to 200 miles, which has been previously suspended. That's true. And that consideration has been given to a site relocation options. However, possible recipient sites would only be for county projects. It just doesn't make any sense to me. The county is doing a recipient site for county projects, and maybe that's what he meant. So do you want me to suggest the change? Is that how it
I
works?
guess, but I'm going to ask so we can do it all, maybe you do it all at once. I also have an observation, and does anyone else have an observation about the February 7th minutes? Sarah Lee?
Hi, on line 10 of the February 7th meeting minutes, it says, in the middle of that line, it says in the annual report, and I think what was stated, hopefully, but certainly what was intended is the work plan, not the annual report.
Thank you. And I would just like to make an observation, lines 20 through 22. It's environmental council, not environmental coalition. We keep having this happen. That is on, I'm sorry, I didn't write down the page, line 2022 I think it's the first page. It's, I'm sorry, I didn't copy the whole thing. And there's also mention of a shot clock timing mandates, and just later someone can re-explain that to me. I got lost on what that was. I'm assuming it was accurate.
Bill, can you tell us what page you were reading from?
Page 3. Sorry.
Okay, so we have a motion. Bill, would you like to modify your motion to include all the stated?
Sure. The first sentence is okay on page 28. The second sentence is good, but should end on 29 after suspended. And the third sentence would start with consideration has been given to a relocation site, a relocation recipient site for county projects.
Thank you. And also we to include the correction Sarah Lee and I mentioned in your motion.
Yes.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Thank you. All those in favor of approving the minutes as amended?
Aye.
Any opposed? The February 6th minutes are approved, and we will move on to the March 6th minutes. Oh, Suzanne, yes, sorry. Okay.
So I had emailed in asking Chelsea, who sent the minutes. I said in the March 6 minutes, I saw this towards the end of the meeting. It said, in quotes, Vice Chair Gao requested the committee go back and listen to the March 1st meeting, and the staff agreed to provide the link to the March 1st meeting and would note the specific time of the discussion began. And then right after that, there was a vote. So I don't know if this is still needed or not, and I couldn't guess by reading the minutes.
It was distributed from Ginger, though, not from Chelsea, with a timestamp, and it was the March 1st of 2023. So maybe we can check and see if you were somehow inadvertently left off that email or what.
And we did vote on the topic following that, which is why, part of it's confusing. But I think the discussion was, for us, we came to the same conclusion, it seemed, and we just wanted to revisit the justification from last time. And staff also sent out the record of all of the votes we've taken so far so that we could track that.
And that was
I
distributed by
don't-
Chelsea.
If it's not in that email, I don't have it. And that was the reason I asked back. I'm just saying. So, I mean, I understand now, but I couldn't guess this before.
Okay, any changes to the March? Would anyone like to move to approve March 6 minutes or amend?
I'll move to approve.
Second? Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. The March 6 minutes have been approved. I will note that, Clay, you were going to distribute to the members here the county council goals. They are on the website, already downloaded them, but just something that was a follow-up item, not something for a change. Thank you.
Sorry,
That's
that's
all
my fault. I brought them up when we were here, brought them up on the thing. So then I didn't distribute them, but I certainly can.
Thank you. So, under old business, Ginger's going to update us on how Samantha is doing with that code audit tool.
I'm actually going to get up and let Samantha update you, and I will see you all next month. So have a great meeting and see you later.
Okay. Very good. Broken chair. All right, so what we've done so far is that we completed the LID audit. In the last 2 weeks, during all of those discussions, it took months and months to do, identified potential barriers in our code and in our comprehensive plan, and had really good discussions about what we can do for implementation of an ordinance. Right now, we are starting to work on the ordinance itself and comprehensive plan amendment to the future land use element. Once we get that and a technical manual together for you, we will distribute to you all for review and take your feedback and incorporate those into those documents. That's where we're at.
Excellent. Sarah Lee.
What is your timeline? When do you expect that we would see a draft? And it sounds like it would be a lot for us to look at.
It is going to be a lot. Within the next 2 months, you will have something to look at. If I get my computer back, I can give you the exact dates.
I'm
look at my
just
calendar.
looking at approximate and thinking,
You'll have at least 2 to 3 weeks to review.
Okay.
So it would be typically we send it out after an ENRAC meeting, and then the next meeting, we
Okay.
would be able to provide comments.
And what form does that come in? Like a strikeout and delete or a table?
So it'll be typical Word documents for the ordinance language. What we're looking at now is doing a separate division within the code. That's still up for debate. And then for areas if we're doing any strike throughs in the code, you will see that as well in that one ordinance document. Then you'll have a separate document for the future land use element amendment. That will be strike through and then underlined as well. And then for the technical manual, that'll be its own Microsoft Word document. And that's going to be the document that takes you a while to review. There's a lot of information in there. It provides examples, all the BMPs, the maintenance requirements and everything. And that's still completely under construction right now.
not for us to have to discuss now, but mostly so that Samantha can think about this. Knowing what this group is like and listening to what I just heard listed, I'm going to suggest that some thought be given to how we can be most constructive in a timely manner with our comments.
May I recognize myself? I think that's a great point. I don't want to spend a lot of time today either because we have a whole lot to learn in managing stormwater. But thinking of our original experience when we started out reading through ordinances and trying to pick those apart rather than sort of a big picture presentation, we've all recognized that that was not efficient on our part. So we can put our thinking caps on and maybe email Sam and Ginger, CC Ginger, or vice versa.
And we have some new members. I don't see Donna.
She's online.
Oh, okay. But Suzanne wasn't here, Donna wasn't here. We, as a committee, did discuss LID, and we, as a committee, actually supported an approach to incorporate LID. So we need to remember that when we are reviewing.
I'll make sure that we provide an overview whenever things go out for what ENRAC has done for LID in the past. And so we're all on the same page. I also can make sure whenever we send it out for review, maybe we'll do it in segments or what have you, but highlight certain areas for you to hone in on. Because there will be certain tables and matrices, especially for the incentives, that we really want your input on. A lot of the rest of the material within the manual is educational for the public, and is from a multitude of different resources. So things that you may have already read before, but there will be matrices and tables in there that you're going to want to comment on.
Thank you, Samantha. Alex. Microphone, please.
When that comes out, you mentioned that there's going to be examples and that are they localized or kind of contextualized to Volusia, or are they just like, here's the pie in the sky LID world?
So when I say examples, I mean for each individual BMP. So we will we'll have pictures, examples, and description on how you do that within our code, the regulation for it.
Okay.
But if there are additional items we need to add, we can do that. I was trying to stay away from having a whole section of the manual, just look at all these things that have been implemented in the past, because the manual is already 30-something pages long with all the other educational material in there. So that's a discussion point we can have.
I don't necessarily think we need to go through and like list all of the examples, but maybe like have one or two really good examples leading into each section. So somebody that's interested in learning more that might not see the clarity in the black and white, being able to actually drive to a site locally and say like, oh, well, I want to learn about rain gardens, let me go to that section. Volusia says there's a really good example here. Let's drive there and look at it.
I like that idea. I'm not exactly explaining into detail what those sites may be, but say, hey, this is over here in this location, if you wanted to go and look at it. Okay.
Thank you very much. And Jack.
Just kind of an overall picture. Is this committee the only committee looking at this material, or the only department within the county going through it?
All subject matter experts within the county have been within these meetings for the audit and are going to be within the meetings for the ordinance changes, the comp plan changes, and for the technical manual. So it's everyone from the county working on that. We will be sending it out to stakeholders as well. And REC is a stakeholder, so we'll have it in a meeting. We'll send it out to VCARD and VBIA and those other entities as well.
Very good then. Without further ado, I think we'd like to introduce our county engineer, Tad Casbier, who's going to sing the praises of stormwater management.
We're going to be doing is, per the council's direction, we are taking a look at stormwater, particularly in Volusia County, obviously, as it relates to flooding conditions, as well as potentially some aspects of treatment overall. So in trying to tackle that, what we thought was the best thing to do was to bring everybody an explanation of how stormwater is currently handled. We're going to make some recommendations on the rules. It's important to understand what the rules require and how you go about meeting those rules. So we're breaking it into at least two parts, if not potentially three. Today, we'll be going over how stormwater is done, how we model it, what we take a look at, the different tools that we use to manage it, those aspects of it. Then the next meeting, we would go through what the rules are, not just the county's rules, but the state's rules, federal rules, even some of the municipalities in Volusia County have their own specific rules. Though we may just touch on those a little bit, but go through that aspect of it. And then the last part would be providing some recommendations, some thought processes on things that we would want to or recommend that the board consider for changes to the rules or to the design aspects that go into it. So that's what we're thinking is potentially 2, maybe 3 meetings to go through that aspect of it. But today is more about learning how we handle stormwater and what the what the results of bad stormwater management can be. So I'm assuming everybody remembers grade school with the water cycle. It's pretty straightforward. Stormwater planning is predicated based on the water cycle overall. In particular, it focuses on the left-hand side of the water cycle in this particular exhibit, the rainfall, the precipitation, and then once it makes contact with the ground, does it become surface water, surface runoff, or does it become groundwater and groundwater flow? Ultimately, it makes its way down to a collection point. The overall cycle also includes evaporation, transpiration, and evapotranspiration. During stormwater conditions, those do not play much of a part at all. Obviously, you're not going to have much evaporation if it's raining outside. So same thing with transpiration and evapotranspiration. So everything we're going to be basically talking about today is centered upon stormwater. So it's going to be stormwater runoff, surface runoff, and groundwater flow overall. So stormwater attenuation. Attenuation is a fancy way to talk about flooding aspects. Stormwater rules are predicated basically on two things. One, making sure you don't flood out your neighbors, and also treating water. We'll talk about the treating quite a bit later on overall, but flooding or attenuation is the primary aspect, and usually the one where you feel the most immediate effect. The state statutes are pretty simple in this regard. Basically, if you have an existing site, you are allowed to have the same amount of water at the same rate flow off of it. So if you're going to come in and you've got an existing piece of property and it has nothing on it, the amount of water that would come off of it in that particular situation as stormwater runoff, both the volume and the rate, are the same amount that if you came in and decided you were going to put a Dollar General or a subdivision or something along those lines on it. So you're going to be coming in, you're going to be changing the surface, you're going to increase that runoff. It's your responsibility to hold that difference or restrict that difference so that your downstream neighbors don't see more or at a greater rate than what they do before you built anything. So how do we do that? We've got to manage that stormwater runoff. Surface water runoff is the most important aspect of it because as you can imagine, it runs much quicker, moves much quicker than the groundwater flow does. So figuring out the stormwater runoff, right, is the key factor. So how much stormwater runs off of a particular site is based on three different factors. The overall size of the basin, the area that the stormwater is falling in, then the rate at which water either infiltrates into the ground or runs off, and then finally overall the size of the storm is a large factor in how much water will be coming off of the basin. And then, as I noted, really what you're looking at is, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Will we eventually have a copy of this?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, this will get posted. Sorry. Then, as I noted, for the requirements, you're supposed to make sure that it doesn't run off any more in the post condition than it does in the pre or historic or existing condition. So you're basically running the model twice. One to determine what's existing now, how much water runs off now based on the size of the basin, the current infiltration rates versus the runoff rates for a standardized size storm. Then you're running the post using that same size storm, but with your new characteristics for your basin size, which may change a little bit, or your runoff or infiltration rates, which are usually the biggest change from pre to post.
Question?
Yes, ma'am.
Probably too geeky at this point, but given our experience with hurricanes Ian and Nicole, and the fact that we've had a couple of 100-year floods or
Plus, yes.
yeah, rain, do we use like the most recent data set so that those events are incorporated into the reference data for determining how much water is I mean,
We will get to that in just a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm basically taking it in the order that I just had it. So we'll get into the basins first, and we'll get into the runoff rates, and then we'll get into the storms and how we get into that. And that is a good point, though. With everything I'm presenting here, I've tried to take all the technical aspects out of it. Like, we won't show any stormwater models. I'm not going to get into equations. I'm not going to ask anybody to run an integral or any of that kind of crap.
And I really, yeah.
I know Tyler-
That's tragic.
I know
was
Tyler
looking
is
forward to
definitely
that.
disappointed, so, but,
I just want to know you were doing it.
yeah. So, but I am trying to keep this as simple as possible overall. One of the things that we're going to do is we're going to run through this real quick. And then I've got a certain site that we have done in the last 6, 7 years. Well, actually, I guess it's now about 10 years. So we can kind of walk through it with that so you can see how these different things are applied. And there will be some technical aspects of that, but I'm going to skip over a good portion of that. But all right. So first part of figuring out stormwater runoff is a basin. So how do we determine what a basin is? A basin is basically an area with a common collection point for stormwater. So you take a look at the exhibit, the picture that's up there, you see the red outline. You'd see that if anything on the outside of that red line, if stormwater were to fall in that area, it would not fall into the area overall. It's on the peak of the mountain. Water falls on this side, it's going to flow down that side of the hill. It falls on this side, it's going to flow down that side of the hill. So assuming this is our common collection point, basically everything in this red area, that water, whether it's surface runoff or groundwater infiltration, would make its way to that particular point. Okay. So that's our size of our overall basin. Now, you may only be working in a portion of that particular basin, and you can have sub-basins overall. Keep in mind that, for example, a good portion of the water on this side of the county ultimately makes its way to the St. Johns River, and the St. Johns River ultimately makes its way down to the Atlantic Ocean up in Jacksonville. So if your collection point were the mouth of the St. Johns River, your basin would be a vast majority of everything that's the St. Johns River all the way down to down in Osceola County in that area. So south of us into Brevard, the headwaters of the St. Johns River would be part of that basin. That said, we're not studying that entire area to figure out if your Dollar General or subdivision is going to have more runoff. You're doing a more localized sub-basin aspect of it overall, and that's what we'd be looking at on particular developments. So that said, we also have different types of basins. Not every basin, the collection point ultimately results in water making its way. You need to let somebody in or something? All right. So not every basin is open to the ocean, ultimately. Okay. The basins that are, we call those open basins. The water ultimately can make its way by surface path to the ocean, using even a medium-sized storm. Closed basins or landlocked basins are pretty common on this side of the county. These are basins in which the water never actually leaves the area. It goes to the lowest point in that basin and has no flow path to get out. So there's a big distinction between the two. Ultimately, and how the stormwater is handled doesn't change very much, but it is handled a little bit differently when it gets to how we manage the stormwater overall. All right. So now we know what our basin size is, and the next thing we've got to do is figure out how much stormwater runoff we're going to have versus infiltration. So as you can see with the two pretty pictures there that I scrounged the internet for, you've got your pervious condition, typically is what your existing site will generally look like. Maybe a few more bugs and bunnies on it, but generally that's what it would look like. And then afterwards, you come build your Dollar General or your subdivision, and now you've got pavement. So the surface cover is usually your biggest determining factor in how much water infiltrates. That said, the other factors can play a big part. Slope of the ground. Now in Florida, that's not much of a problem. But if you go to North Georgia, you go to West Virginia hills, you've got slopes that are like this. It really doesn't matter if the ground is great for soaking in water or not. The slope is going to cause it to run off. Again, here in Florida, where our biggest hills are 3 feet tall, that's really not much of a factor overall. The soil type also has a big effect. If you go to the beach, you can see the water moves right through that sandy soil very easily, doesn't get impeded in any way, shape, or form. Certainly compared to clayey kind of soils or organic material, potting soil, those types of things are designed to hold that water, grab it, and keep it. Next aspect is voids in the soils. A lot of times you think about this is how well has the soil's been compacted. If they're bigger grains of sand, they're obviously going to be greater voids. If they're smaller types of soils, then they're not going to be as many voids overall. Then also you have saturation. So if you get a storm, that's not too big a deal. But if you've got 3 storms in a row and those voids in that space have now been occupied, obviously the second or third storm can't put water where water already exists. So now you've got greater runoff. So you'll have more runoff with more frequent storms as well.
So the thing I don't see on that list on that previous slide is vegetation cover because
Surface cover. That's where I wrapped that in there.
okay, because obviously when we have vegetation, it helps things
Right.
infiltrate better than if
Right.
it's just bare ground. So
Yeah, and so as you see with the pervious, you see the vegetation in there, and actually with this next one, we'll get a little bit more into that. So now we've got to be able to take those criteria and turn it into something we can use in our stormwater models, because that's the important part of it. So there are a couple different factors, like we talked about, and how we assign a value to that existing ground. Okay, the impervious surface, as you see up there, is pretty easy to assign. All of them, sidewalks, parking, buildings, asphalt, concrete, basically is what we consider a 98. And while this is called a curve number, and it's not really a percentage, but at the same time, it's a similar concept. So we'll just consider it a percentage for purposes of this discussion. Basically, what this is saying is that those impervious surfaces, 98% of that water is going to run off. There's always a little bit that percolates into even the hardest surface overall. So we'd assign a 98 to that. Then you can see below that the other different types of ground cover / soils that you might encounter. Everything from open space lawns that we all have, or most of us have, to dense forest, those types of things. So the other factor we talked about was the soil characteristics. We assign soils grades, everything that from A to D basically, and for the most part, A basically means that it's well drained. The water moves through it at a very good rate. It doesn't hold it very well. D soils, you're at the opposite end of that spectrum. You've got clay, you've got organics, things that would either slow water down, or in some cases, like with the organics, it'll actually grab that water and hold on to it. So with the range in between. So that's what the A, B, C, D across the top portion of that is. So depending on your soil type, depending on your ground cover, those types of things, you're assigning a curve number to that particular section. Good question.
Getting at Wendy's question, I think a little more, between the surface coverage and your stormwater models, we're factoring in the impervious surface coverage and the soil groups and that side of things. But does that account for a highly dense tree canopy being able to suck up that water, or is it just the soil?
This is just determining the runoff aspect of it. So that your question is, would the vegetation soak some of that water in? And it does, but not during the time period in which the storm event occurs.
Section, yeah.
Yeah, we'll hit on it here in a second. It's really getting to Melissa's earlier question with regard to rainfall overall. Most of the duration events that we look at, and rain is measured, rainfall events are generally set in a frequency and a duration. And most of the durations we typically deal with generally max out at 24 hours overall. So during that event, you're not getting that much ground soakage. into it. The other aspect that we take a look at, and there's certain things that we ignore overall because they would actually, by ignoring them, we're being conservative. So yes, the ground might absorb certain things. Overall, there's the evaporation, transpiration. Does that occur at zero even though it's raining? No, not necessarily. But at a measurable amount, something that we can control or actually measure, no. So we just ignore it, assuming that by its occurrence, it's actually a conservative, that we're ignoring that aspect of it. Okay.
Is the water table level, the groundwater, is that what helps define what type soil, or is that a separate variable?
No, we consider it a separate variable
And that
overall
comes
because the
into
water
play.
table can change as you go throughout. And the saturation level that we talked about, that immediate, that plays into it, but that's how we would factor the ground level. Usually when we get into the design, and we'll talk a little about it a little bit later, we set a static elevation, even though we know this system is going to change depending on what year, the amount of rainfall, so on and so forth. We try to take a worst case scenario and assign that. And so that should account for any of those variations in the water table overall, because we're taking basically the worst one when we design. Yes, ma'am.
So I always like to be the representative dum-dum. So HSG A through D is the range of the soil types from most permeable, sandy soil. Percolation goes quickly to clayey soil, and HSGD, which is denser. And then so if I just, as a dum-dum, want to understand something I'm reading here, a dense forest type, which we're categorizing the cover as woods, if it's in sandy soil, then the runoff, the percent of runoff of what would fall would be approximately 36% on sandy soil. And if we go to the D extreme, then we're looking at 79% of that.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Just wanna, I like to do my personal moron.
No, that's fine. That's good. That's good. So I did pose the question, what would you expect the number be for the wetlands? And so part of the reason I bring this up, because it's not really covered in the table above, is wetlands you would generally expect to be more of the clay or organic type soils. So you would generally be on that level. And then really it depends on whether or not you've got water above ground or below ground. Not all wetlands obviously have water above ground in each aspect of it. But if the water is above ground, like it would be for a lake or a stream, then at that point, every drop of water that hits it is running off. So if it's a wetland, in this case, where you have water below grade, then you would have some absorption. But again, you'd expect that the soils are probably bad. So you're actually generally expecting that wetlands produce quite a bit of runoff overall. So that said, they're usually at the low spot, and that's where the water is sitting and getting held if it doesn't have a path to the ocean.
And would be a case in which 100% runoff might be potentially beneficial.
So, all right. So we started talking a little bit about this. The last aspect.
You know, about the mass going into getting to the ponding element of this. Wouldn't the root structures of the highly dense organic areas, the high vegetation areas, wouldn't that create voids in your soil?
It can. Yeah. Keep in mind what we're talking about is the amount of runoff that's created overall, not the groundwater.
Yeah, I guess on my end, the runoff is the amount that's not retained at
Not
that
absorbed in the
location.
ground. Right. Doesn't percolate. Infiltrate.
So with that being said, in this process, if the foundational mats, and sorry for getting really technical here, but in this process, if the foundational mats aren't talking through or accounting for the like root structure voids, and we're ignoring that. We're saying that's too complicated to throw into this equation. Is that not kind of limiting a little bit of that soil storage ability there? Where we're saying, I know this is really technical for an ENRAC call, but
And I think you're getting into how the roots altering the soil structure would
Yeah.
affect the percolation rate. And you're sequestering carbon from the air, and you go through the entire process of soaking up water and minerals from the soil and then putting a structure in there, it eventually rots. It's
de minimis.
Yeah.
I guess at the end.
Yeah,
of the
I
day.
mean, if anything, it could be clogging.
The voids like saturation are have less of an effect than, say, the soils or the ground cover, pardon me, overall, or the slope. But those are going to be your predominant. The voids, help, that gives you storage, but it really affects more your saturation overall.
Okay.
So, all right. Rainfall. As I mentioned earlier, we take a look at storms in two different ways. We take a look at the frequency, how often, what's the chance it could happen. So one of the most common that everybody thinks about is the 100-year storm that gets discussed pretty much anytime there's been a hurricane or anything along those lines. And it's the storm that you use to model floodplains and that type of thing. So that's the one that most people commonly think about. Now, 100-year storm doesn't mean it's going to happen once every 100 years. It's really just the probability that it might happen. So you can have multiple 100-year storms in a year. You can have multiple 500-year storms in a year. It's just a % chance that it might occur. That said, most of the time you're likely, obviously, not to have one of those, but there's always a chance. So the other aspect we take a look at is the duration of a storm. So if you get a 100-year storm, it may not be a 24-hour storm, and that's 100-year 24 is, again, that's the storm that we use for floodplain. As far as most of the stormwater calculations, really the duration is a minimal effect. We take a look at the volume aspects of it for the most part, and whether you're collecting 11 inches over 1 day or 4 days, it's still 11 inches. The different size storms are actually calculated. They do have there's quite a bit of science in it. I don't necessarily understand exactly every aspect of it, so I will avoid trying to get into that explanation of it. But they do have a set definition for each of the different size storms. And then the state set their specific requirements. And actually, that's the storms that I have listed, or what the state spells out for those types of storms. You'll see that I've got noted in there the amount of rainfall that's typically associated with those particular storms. Those storm rates, that amount actually depends on where you're located. Okay. The very blurry picture on the right-hand side, those lines indicate the amount of storm water that would occur during a particular storm. And you can see that it's different in Lake County, say, than it is in Volusia County. And you can see in point of fact, where you are in Volusia County, that storm intensity of the rainfall amount changes depending on whether you're on the east side or on the west side for that same level of storm. I've actually now got these down to the point where you can just enter your coordinates on a computer program. It'll tell you for a 25-year, 96-hour storm, this is exactly the amount of rainfall you've got. So we generally don't get into setting those. There's quite a bit more into that. If you really care to get that technical about it, we can talk about it afterwards. But overall, so that's established. The important part of it, of the stormwater modeling. The amount is important, but the most important part is making sure that whatever you use for your precondition is the exact same thing you use for your post condition, because that's what you're measuring, is how much rainfall ran off in that pre versus that post. If you change your storm, obviously that has an effect on the amount of runoff that occurs. So we take a look at those three factors, put them together.
Excuse
and then
excuse
figure
me,
out-
Bob has a question.
Sorry.
Ouch. Ted, can you give us for practicality, the name of a few storms maybe that have been 100-year storms or some recent 50 years, just so that we have a grasp on,
Yeah.
was
Sure.
the last hurricane 100-year? Was it a 50? Was it a 25?
Okay, that's a good question. As I just discussed, and as we saw in the previous exhibit, storm 2596 on the east side of the county is not the same on the west side of the county. So for example, when pretty sure it was Ian came through and dropped 20 inches over New Smyrna Beach, it did not drop the same amount of rain in DeLand or in Deltona and those areas. So there's quite a bit of variability, but at 20 inches over New Smyrna Beach, everybody says, well, it's greater than a 100-year storm. Well, the way those curves work, they're actually exponential. So it was probably greater than a 500-year storm when you run the numbers out overall for 20 inches over that period of time. So Tropical Storm Faye was 20 inches in DeBerry overall. So that was around a 500-year storm event. A lot of the hurricanes back in 2004, I think it was Charlie, was close to a 100-year event, but it felt worse because it had been raining beforehand. And it was raining even before the first hurricane came in, and everything was saturated at that point. So even then, exacerbates that particular problem. So having the storms on top of each other is almost as big a problem as it is just having one big storm. All right, so using those previous factors, we figure out the difference in the amount of water that would be running off. Now it's incumbent upon the design engineer to figure out how to impound that volume of water or to slow it down so that you're not discharging at the same rate or at a lesser rate than previous. So everybody's, I'm sure, familiar with most of the methods that engineers use: wet and dry ponds, underground storage, swales, a lot of LID methods that this group has looked at. Those are the common means for tackling those types of issues. So how do we go about it? So we've got that volume that we've figured out. That water has to be stored above the water table. Everything below there is obviously occupied with the existing groundwater that's there. So we have to go above that. Now, so that's the first factor we look at, is what is the water table for the particular area overall. And we're looking at the runoff volume that we just calculated. And we take a look at the soil characteristics for the area in which we're potentially going to put our stormwater pond or whatever method we're using to control the stormwater. And then if it's in a wet condition, we also have to take a look at the tailwater, which is the area downstream that any of this water might be flowing into if it were an open basin. So once we know what the water table elevation is, that pretty much tells us what type of system we're going to be using, whether it's wet or dry. If the water table is close to ground level, overall, you're pretty much going to be in a wet condition. So there aren't too many types of wet systems out there. Wet ponds are about the only game in town as far as that goes overall. So if your groundwater is high versus your property line or your groundwater or your ground elevations, then you're going to be with a wet stormwater system. You've got 4 or 5 feet, something along those lines, then you can start taking a look at other types of systems. Again, dry ponds, underground storage, those types of things. But you've got to have the room, you've got to have space between the bottom of your pond or the bottom of your system and that water table elevation. Now, to Sarah Lee's question with regard to setting that water table elevation, one of the things that that's done prior to beginning work is that you'll get a geotechnical engineer out to the site, and he'll take borings across the site to identify what we call the seasonal high water table, as well as the existing water table. Now, the existing water table can fluctuate, so we don't rely on that. Depending on when you do the boring, if it hasn't rained in 6 months, then that water table is generally going to be depressed compared to its normal elevation. Your seasonal high is basically during the rainiest portions of the year, what does that water table elevation come to? Now, you almost never end up doing your geotech borings during that time of year. So the geotech engineer will go ahead and take a look at the soils from that boring. And usually there are markers in that soil that identify, when the water table comes up to that elevation on a regular basis. It'll markers on the soil, changes to the soil, things like that they'll identify. And so we use that elevation as our water table elevation for our stormwater calculations. The idea being that, look, that's the worst case in the year. That's where everything should be set at a minimum overall. So once you've identified what your water table is, then that really dictates, again, wet or dry. And then if it's dry, then it basically dictates the elevation that you can dig your pond to. So again, let's say the water table's at 5 feet below ground, your seasonal high. So we're now going to consider that our design normal water level, our water table level. So we would want to put our stormwater pond or other element. I'm going to use pond because it's just the first thing I think of. But if we had underground storage, it'd be the same concept. We're going to leave a certain amount of space between that water table elevation and the bottom of our system overall. And then we're going to take that volume of water that we calculated to increase from the existing condition to the post condition. And we're going to put that into our system. And that's going to get us to a certain elevation in that pond. All right. And that's what we call our max stage or peak stage in that stormwater pond. Okay. And from that, then we move on to setting the other elevations in our particular development. So we know that if we have a 25-year, 96-hour storm, the water level is going to come to 3. And so we want to make sure that all of our roads or our parking lots are not flooding. We want them to be above that. So the stormwater collection system, whether it's a group of inlets and pipes, or whether or not it's bioswales or swales or something along those lines, we're going to want that to be above that elevation. Otherwise, the system won't work very well. And then, so from that elevation, the top of those, then we'll go ahead and set our road elevation or our parking elevation, because that's what we're trying to keep drawing. And then above and beyond that, we'll set another increase between our parking areas or our roads and our finished floor elevations for our buildings or our homes. So, sure everybody's seen a lot of the new subdivisions. You got their stormwater ponds out there, and then you take a look at that first home, and it looks like it's 8 feet above everything that's around. Well, that's all geared based on those elevations, all originally set by a geotech looking at a boring. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I feel like I can ask this because nobody in this room is a geotech engineer or working for a geotech company. Over the last 20 years, have we seen in our geotech reports a rise in the seasonal high water table?
The quick answer to that will be no, because nobody goes and does a historic look. If we were doing geotech borings in the same spot over the course of time, then yes, you might expect your geotechnical engineer to see a rise or a change in terms of that particular water table. But no, because we don't do any historical monitoring along those lines. Now, I believe the county does have water table monitoring piezometers at certain locations, and they monitor groundwater based on that, but that's obviously localized to that particular monitor. But no, when you're doing a development, all you're taking a look is that snapshot in time, which is why that seasonal high is important. And if it's set poorly, and most of the time you see flooding problems in new subdivisions or new developments, that's the first thing I would look at is what was the seasonal high that was established, and everything was predicated based on.
Can we get in the next month or two, can we actually have you all gather those places where the county has monitored with the piezometers? I'd love to see those data, and I know St. John's has some.
It's not top secret, right?
No, we send that out as part of our water
Tom Carey used to do it, so now Jennifer Spain does that.
Yeah.
Let me see what we have and how we can better aggregate it.
And St. John's has some groundwater monitors
Yeah.
for the area as well, so it would be great to. Huh? Okay.
Yeah, and they're quite a few different ways it's monitored. You got the surface water and the groundwater. You can get them to do it over time. I think that's what Sarah Lee's looking for. Right.
See what we can do.
Now, again,
Yeah, I just think it's important because if this is an opportunity to update our code, then we need to be doing it based on current conditions, which is, I mean, with climate change, we're moving in a particular direction, and we know that the groundwater is going to be coming up, whether it has yet or not.
Yeah.
but again, it's going to be very localized overall. So, discussion with regard to like ocean level rise, that's going to have an effect on the groundwater table nearest the ocean, but it's going to have a minimal effect or reduced effect the farther you get away from the ocean overall. So but it'll affect your tailwater conditions, but it won't have that great of an effect on your tailwater conditions, except at the ocean.
Even, I'm not sure I'm agreeing with that statement. Where I'm troubled is I'm thinking about how floodplains have changed. And that areas that, and I can use my experience when I was responsible for the school district facilities. We had schools that at one point in time were not in the 100-year floodplain, but became in a 100-year floodplain when FEMA revised. And to me, that was because of rising water.
No, actually, that was a combination of things. One, when FEMA originally did, not to get too sidetracked, but when FEMA originally did the floodplains, they modeled them using USGS quad maps. Quad maps only are approximations of ground level, and they're based on 5-foot contours, not single-foot contours. So one of the greatest changes back in 2012 or whatever it was, 14 in that range, FEMA came to us, we gave them our contour maps from our LiDAR where we overflew the entire county and got contours that were within 3 inches of accuracy through the most part. And that's why you saw a change to a lot of the lines, because they were interpolating between 2 5-foot lines if they modeled it, and most of their modeling was not Nat's ass detail, it was at a very high level. So they were, if it said it was 13, they were interpolating between the 10 and the 15. And that's not how it works. One, those lines weren't very good in the first place, and two, the interpolation doesn't ground. That's too much of a difference, 5-foot contours. 1-foot contours, you get a lot more accuracy. The other aspect is that, for example, we talked about closed basins, and particularly here on the west side of the county, we are filled with closed basins. I mean, there are a large number, and certainly a disproportionate number compared to the eastern side of the county. When they ran the models, they didn't care about any of those small closed basins. So almost none of the small closed basins have floodplains according to the map. That said, you ask an engineer what's going to happen if you put a 100-year storm in that area, he's going to be able to tell you what the water level came to, because it's not that difficult a calculation. But the maps from FEMA are a recommendation for the most part. It is still up to the engineers to make the determinations. The purpose of the FEMA maps was originally to provide for the potential for flooding insurance. That's it. Hey, if you live in this area, you probably want to get flood insurance. It was not to say, hey, this is how the world needs to be designed in any way, shape, or form. So the level of accuracy isn't there. So one of the things that, when a site is being prepared for development, they'll go in their survey and they'll provide a more accurate survey than even our 1-foot contours will provide. And then, those floodplain lines are, again, tied to a particular elevation in most cases, get shifted and adjusted even then. So that's why you saw the biggest difference. It didn't have anything to do with, they haven't, as far as I'm aware, when they reran their maps, they did not change the tailwater condition in the ocean in any way, shape, or form. So that's not tied to sea level rise, as far as I know. So, okay, yes, ma'am.
And another tangential question. So I live very near the ocean on the east side where I grew up. And we used to, in the past, we've had issues with saltwater intrusion along the
Sure.
coast. And we will again, certainly. So the monitoring that's done, whether by USGS or by the district, or I would assume that that would be an area of interest of having recurring snapshots would be where we have our drinking water wells, which is of course farther
Right, but I would be,
west.
I would not be, I would not expect those wells to do anything more than monitor the elevation. I doubt they're checking the salinity.
No? Okay. Interesting. And I know that's tangential, but resiliency is something that's going to come up. Thank you.
Bob?
They weren't using markers in the soil. They were going down and going, oh, work, it was 10 feet below the ground. But next year, it was 5 feet. below
And that's
the ground.
exactly what they did for my replacement drain field, grandfathered to be at a deeper depth than current standards require.
The septic tanks still do that, yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, Alex.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry,
I'm
Alex.
trying to get it down there. I'm trying.
Pat, you're not off the hook yet.
All right.
Alex and
Alex.
Tyler both had questions too. I'm so sorry.
Alex first, Tyler's always next.
So, this may be a little, I guess, out of sequence for what we were thinking.
There's no sequence with any of that.
Oh, yeah.
By all means, go ahead and ask.
With that being said, using, I'm assuming like Atlas 14 or something like that as the basis for the rainfall precipitation totals. With the Resilient Florida program and the CRS program, they're asking local governments to look into NOAA intermediate, low and high for the 2017 projection there. There's discussions to update it to 2022. With that being said, if you kind of look at that as the foundation, you've got the sea level rise element, adjusting tailwaters and things like that. But then concurrently, with that research, there's DoD research that suggests, I think it's by 2040, there's 1.14 times higher amounts of rainfall than we're seeing today. And then by 2070, I think it's like 1.2. And then by 2100, it's 1.3 times more rain. Is there any intention in the county to adjust those factors to try to kind of account for that future flood condition that, I mean, the Federal Department of Defense is saying is a very real factor?
Yes.
How quickly do you see that happening for us?
Actually, one of the things that I stumbled upon as I was trying to prepare this overall is there's now actually the ability, there's a firm, or actually, sure, NOAA, pardon me, is the one that establishes the storms overall. They actually now have a website where if you go in and put in your location, it'll tell you what your storm amounts are depending on the type of storm overall.
And that's Atlas 14, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the current, that's
right.
More of that historic data logging. I'm talking about projecting for the climate change.
Forecasting data and what he's talking about too.
Yes, it's got that in there.
They're pulling NOAA forecasting data.
I'm aware of that, but that's the present day condition. That's not 2040, 2070, and 2100.
I gotcha.
That's not the multipliers there. So we're setting the standards and
again, the important part is that you're measuring, you're using the two same type of storms.
I get that.
That, that
wait.
takes out a large part of the variability that goes along with it.
What I'm trying to say is our current regulatory footprint is for our 100-year storm. Is that correct?
No.
Our kind of setting the elevations of our stormwater systems are
No.
based on.
No,
I remember vaguely you said something about the 100-year 24-hour storm.
yeah. So the storms that we generally identify, okay, and it's depending on whether it's an open basin or a closed basin.
Yeah.
Okay. So on an open basin, because you've always got the outfall, the ability for that water to make it ultimately to the ocean as surface water, then you're generally only looking at a 25-year, 24-hour storm.
So take this as the benchmark. That's the 25-year for current kind of considerations of what our rainfall is doing. You take 8 inches and multiply that by 1.3, you get a lot, or not necessarily a lot more rain, but an adjusted rain. So our standard that we're building for now during the life cycle of the structures, we will be surpassing some of that.
That's a possibility, certainly.
I'd say it's a high possibility if we're looking at the federal climate research and saying that is something we need to be considering.
That's something you can consider. And that's not something that the current rules take into account, and certainly not something that's designed to at this point.
Okay.
But that's part of the reason we put in as many safety factors as we generally do as well. I have not bothered to hit on most of those because again, most of them are ancillary. So go ahead, Tyler.
So I have a few things I wanted to touch on. The first is, Sarah Lee, you were asking if we've seen the seasonal high water table levels rise over time. One of the things that we have that's almost 100-year-old data now are our soil survey maps. And they were done all over the state of Florida, but we have one for Volusia County. I think it was done in the late 20s. It was part of the alphabet soup of federal programs. And so they mapped all the different soil conditions. And if you're going to, 5 feet down, you maybe have a layer of silt or clay or something else. That'll be described as something you can expect. They have a lot of properties, and they'll have an anticipated water table depth on that. And they're not perfect. I mean, this is 100-year-old data, and it was taken by a grid method before GPS or anything else. I mean, it's absolutely impressive how accurate it is. It matches pretty well with the geotech data that I get today on a site. If it's undeveloped and the area around it hasn't been substantially changed, chances are I could plug in the soil survey data and do a pretty good concept design on it. And then when I get my real geotech, have it work. Every now and then I get surprised by something, but so consistency hasn't really been the issue. It's, like Bob mentioned, the way that we established our seasonal highs did change within the industry, but that is mostly we didn't have it right originally, and we've refined our method. Touching on the FEMA maps, they're called FIRMs, flood insurance rate maps. I mean, so it's exactly to establish flood insurance rates. We have different flood zones that are the 100-year flood risk zones. Some are based on models. Some are based on historic aerials of, hey, this flooded during the storm that fit about 100-year flood. So we just traced the aerial. Well, as imagery got better and our ability to get instant imagery after a storm got better, the accuracy of those maps got better. So there's a lot of factors, like Tad was mentioning, that led to the high inaccuracy that we had 20 years ago. The soil stains that we're looking at are iron deposits and salt deposits. They're pretty reliable. If you go look at a bridge or something else near a salt water that has tidal rise and fall, rust happens right above the water line. So in those tidal zones, you'll see the aggressive rust staining process. The same type of thing happens in our soil. We get our calcium deposits and other things. So our staining method is pretty reliable for establishing water table. It's just you don't always have that much iron or calcium floating around in the soil. It's what do you do when it's just beach sand or something along those lines. Dealing with what storm volumes do we use? When Tad was talking about there's websites we can plug in our coordinates. We have intensity, duration, and frequency curves. We just call them IDF curves. So I can't say it quickly. That are established by the state of Florida. They're coming from FDEP. They're developed in concert with federal government as well as with FDOT because they've got more stormwater engineers than most of the state agencies. And that's where the county's getting the data from right now. We're referencing in the code a design storm. If that design storm value is changed by the state, it would automatically be affecting what's used at the county level. And, I think that's where the county doesn't have the level of expertise to get into storm forecasting 20 or 30 years down the road. And, I would just caution our committee from, trying to run down that rabbit hole too far. But that's all I wanted to add.
So everything we've been talking about at this point is really more predicated towards the volume of stormwater runoff that we've collected, but the rate can be just as important. Obviously, when you put down impervious surface over something that used to be pervious, the water's going to run off at a much quicker rate. Even though you may not ultimately discharge as much, but if you discharge faster, then those downstream areas aren't used to that amount of water in that period of time. You can cause flooding in those particular situations. So that's the other thing that we monitor is not just the volume, but the rate overall. So that's an important portion of it. How do we do that? How do we regulate the rate overall? So we usually put in a discharge control structure, what we'll call it. Usually if you look at it on a stormwater pond, it usually looks like an inlet. Overall, the elevations have been set such that water can discharge over time. So for example, if you've got a large amount of water coming in, but you only put in a small 2 to 6 inch pipe, then you can really restrict the amount of flow of water out that way. And that's generally what we do overall to make sure that we're not exceeding the pre-development requirements in that aspect of it. All right. So we've now got a full pond. The storm has passed on. It's important that that stormwater system return to its pre-storm condition. You don't want it to recover too quickly, but at the same time, you don't want it to take too long either. The county does not regulate this aspect of it. The Water Management District, the DEP, the state, they do overall. And there are different ways that you can recover your system. If it's a wet system, you can do it by an orifice, again, a smaller pipe that allows water to flow. You'd set it at the normal water level in your pond, pre any of the stormwater runoff. You'd set it at that elevation, and with a small pipe, it just allows a certain amount of flow to continue over time. Overall, you also will still get some percolation even in those wet ponds. It may not be going down, but it will be going out as the surrounding area water table drops after a storm. As well. And then in dry systems, you're stuck with percolation. There's really no other way for the water to get out. It just filters into the soil and becomes groundwater, which predominantly mimics the condition that occurred prior to the storm, where you had that much as groundwater in the first place. So that's the surface runoff. Now we get into groundwater. Water infiltrates in via percolation, and then you've got a defined water table that generally sits there. Any of that new water comes in, generally tries to level out. Groundwater typically mimics, in terms of its elevation, the existing ground. So if you've got a slope, usually your groundwater has a slope to it. It may not match exactly. Variabilities in the soil, voids, all those different characteristics can have an effect on what that water table elevation does as it relates to the groundwater elevation or the ground elevation. But that's generally what it does. So you ultimately, during that storm, you're going to have that interflow, as it's identified on this graphic, working to equalize and get back to what it's used to overall. As you can understand or expect, groundwater flows at a much slower rate than surface runoff, which is why if you go ahead and turn a site from grass and lawn into impervious surface, you get that water moving. It moves much quicker than it does through the ground. That's what you're you're trying to fight when you put in that stormwater system. The major effect on groundwater is confining layers. Confining layer is just a soil type that really does not percolate very well. Usually acts as an impediment to flow. It doesn't mean it won't flow through that layer. It just means it takes it a really long time to do so. So that leads into discussion on closed basins. We talked about a little bit earlier. These are areas where the water falls in that basin and the collection point doesn't have an outfall ultimately to the ocean. So, like I said, West Volusia has a large number of these. A vast majority of the subdivisions in town, a lot of the developments in town go to closed basins. The problem with that is that those areas are highly susceptible to flooding, particularly if you've got a confining layer, something along those lines that really does not allow that water to percolate out. So since percolation is your only means, as I said, a confining layer really kills your ability to recover, as well as higher amounts of rainfall. And that doesn't mean a big storm alone. That means continuous rain at a higher rate over a longer period of time, which is generally going to be worse for you than if you have one localized big storm. Yeah.
Only means of recovery is the percolation. There's no calculation for evaporation at that point?
No.
Okay.
No. Again, we exclude it to a large part because it's a safety factor. There is some that does occur, but as far as control over that aspect of it, there's minimal control over it. It's greatly dependent on your weather conditions, your air conditions, that aspect of it. And there's no good way to model something you don't have control over. So, yeah. So, this is the average rainfall, annual rainfall for the city of DeLand. This is so you can see, for example, back in 2000, it was a pretty nice year. It was 42 inches. Then it jumped up to 76, then down to 62, 53. And there's quite a bit of variability really until you get to about 2009, 2010. And then you start to see things generally even out. The issue gets to be this last 6 years, 7 years. You take a look at 5 out of 6 years, you're up above 60 inches. That's a large amount of rain in a short period of time on top of a previous year with that same condition. So, you get into those closed basin discussions. When you get those types of situations, you really just don't have the ability to recover. And so a lot of these closed basins, particularly if there's a confining layer, you're going to hold water. Okay. And, remember, when rain falls, it becomes either surface runoff or it becomes groundwater. Both of those will end up at the low spot in a closed basin. The groundwater will just take longer to get there, but it still gets there and it still all goes to that same place. So whether or not you've got an undeveloped site where a vast majority of it soaks into the ground first, as opposed to runs off, versus a post-development site where a large amount of it runs off and some of it percolates, all of that water still ends up at the bottom. It doesn't go anywhere else. So particularly with closed basins, flooding is a problem, not so much necessarily because of the development that may occur, but because there's no means for recovery with that kind of confining layer. So
Alex has a question.
It's more of a statement for the members of the ENRAC here. So by 2100, my daughter is going to be about 75, and the annual rainfall, if we apply that DOD change coefficient, is about 87 inches of annual rainfall in DeLand, which is much higher than all of those. So just kind of factor that into play when you're thinking about what we should be doing with our regulations.
So that I think that pretty much covers attenuation slash flooding aspects of it. Did mention that we talk about treatment. Don't plan on talking about this too much. The county does not regulate treatment overall. We basically leave that to the state and the feds, and a large part of that is simply because we don't have the expertise or chemical capability to make recommendations on something along those lines. Anytime you're designing a stormwater system, you'll take a look at the water management district criteria. When you look back through their manuals, they actually provide quite a bit of background on the science that they performed for generating the amount of treatment that should be needed or developing how stormwater ponds work overall. We don't have the ability to duplicate that. So our recommendation at this point is to follow those rules or make an effort recommendation, but something that doesn't specifically rely on heavy science to arrive at it. That said, Water Management District and the DEP, as I said, regulate treatment. Treatment is basically picking up that first flush of water that falls in that basin. The idea being that if the pollution is above ground, that water hits it and either picks it up or mixes with it and then moves on. And any later portions of the storm are picking up at such a diminished rate that it's not worth tracking. So your stormwater pond or your stormwater system must retain that first flush. Does not allow, we talked about discharge control structures, and that allows water to move out of your system. But in this case with treatment, that volume has to be retained within the pond. So there's certain designs that we put into those discharge control structures that make sure that that portion of the water does not leave the pond. And then, so how does treatment occur? In wet ponds or wet systems, it's basically the sunlight and oxygen chemically breaking down whatever the pollutants are in that area. Dry ponds or dry systems, the treatment is predominantly through filtration. And then the little germs in the ground, the little microbes will go ahead and eat whatever is in there overall, which is pretty much how filtration works. So that was going to cover the basics on anything. Go ahead, Bill.
So even though the state regulates treatment, they have special basin criteria for impaired water bodies, right? So
Correct.
Different areas are treated to a different level,
Correct.
right?
There are different treatment standards overall, and I just gave it a quick blush. So, but thank you. Yes, the state has water quality data on a vast majority of the basins to identify which ones may be impaired overall. As a part of that, if it is impaired, then there's a different criteria for your stormwater overall, depending on the type of impairment. Vast majority of them are nitrogen or phosphorus. Yeah, the things that you typically find in fertilizer, strangely enough. Yeah. So your pond design gets modified to specifically try to attack that particular type of pollutant. So again, just keeping it simple.
And I do think most of the microbes that are, I mean, they're doing denitrification, they're handling the nitrogen load, but the phosphorus just typically accumulates unless there's an uptake by plants. And then those plants get harvested and hauled away. And then, I mean, there's also heavy metals that can accumulate that are also, not typically handled by microbes. So, I mean, they're
The wet ponds, we have trouble with phosphorus not being phosphorus, you maybe get 40% removal. And so if we need higher than 40% removal, you usually have to pre-treat with a dry pond or use some other system modifier.
right. That's good to get the phosphorus.
Yeah, I was
like the
trying to
pretreatment,
avoid winding Tyler up.
And then when you have a dry pond, it goes in front of the wet pond, which means that your entire development has to be built up so you can get that positive flow into your tailwater.
Okay. All right. So we talked about a lot of stuff, ran through a lot of things. Go ahead, sorry.
I'm not a real loud person. I'm not going to demand to speak. So if I put up my card, I would like to request a 2070 map I brought that up in the very first meeting I attended back in December, and it seemed like the group had already covered it, but I wasn't here when you did cover it, so I'd like the 2070 map.
I assume you know what the hell that is.
Yeah, could you?
So the
explain that?
2070 map, I serve on the Volusia Forever Committee, and when we set the criteria for Volusia Forever, we had 2040 and 2070 maps for Volusia County put up on the screen that showed us the future flooding in Volusia County. And I would really like to have a copy of that. If you guys have already covered that, that's great, but I would like to have a copy of it.
Are
Is
you
that the
speaking-
1,000 Friends of Florida?
Is it the NOAA sea level rise 2070 map? Is that what you're referring? to?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Sea level rise. Yeah.
Right.
We can get that.
Ted, maybe we usually take a break around 2:30.
Okay.
So maybe it's a good time now before we go into the real world example.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay, 10-minute break. Everybody back at 2:35.
Is that enough time to run half walls?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who came back to their chairs or is coming back to their chair. We're going to reconvene our meeting and look at the Hampton Inn.
Not an advertisement for Hampton Inn, by the way. I don't own stock. This is, I thought it makes sense to go ahead and kind of go through a project. It always helped me when I was learning a topic to be able to apply those aspects. And I didn't want to assign homework, so I figured we'd go through it as a group overall. But the Hampton Inn site is north of town here, northwest of the quadrant of US 92 and 17, that area overall. I'm assuming that pretty much everybody is familiar with it overall, but did highlight it on there. To the west, let me back up. To the west, you've got, also on here, you've got the Lake Gertie area overall. And part of the reason I chose this was for that basin, as well as being familiar with the area overall. But Lake Gertie Basin is a closed basin. Water that percolates down to Lake Gertie doesn't go anywhere. So during the hurricanes, water level in there rose quite a bit back in 2005, 2006. Even got into some people's homes on the south end for that reason. But this site, the Hampton Inn site, outlined in yellow, all of this ultimately drains down. And there's the Lake Gertie Basin. So it's a portion of it. It's actually located, the Hampton area. It's located basically at the end of this. Now this, part of the reason I bring this up is this is a USGS quad map. This was how we used to figure out what our elevations were before a topographic survey was done. So like Tyler said, one of the first things you'll do when you're taking a look at a site is pull up the preliminary information while you're waiting for your geotech and your surveyors to go out there and get the site-specific information. But this would allow you to have some kind of idea of what you might be dealing with overall. Also makes it easier with these to identify where the basin lines are, so that it's easy for everybody to kind of follow along with what water is going to Lake Gertie. So, so this is a little further. All right. So this exhibit, this is actually from the engineering plans overall, and you'll see that it's got two parts on there. The bolder lines, the ones that are easier to see, are what was being designed or what was going to be constructed. The lighter lines, the dash lines, those are the existing elements on the site prior to any of the work being done. And I apologize, I only have this in PDF, so I can't strip any of the layers off. But you can see these are the existing ground elevations prior to any work being done out there at the Hampton Inn. These are contour lines. The lower section is here to the left, with US 17, the high point over here on the right. And for those of you that like Culvers, that would be right here. So, yep. We're down around 51 at certain portions. Those obviously change or tweak a little bit. Over here, it's about 57, you can say. Up here, we're at 83, 86 along the road, 87 in that range. So part of the reason I chose a large amount of fall. Okay. And for this state, it is definitely a hill. God dang. I don't know. So when you've got this much fall, obviously it makes it pretty easy to figure out where you want to put your stormwater pond. Water likes to go downhill. So you're obviously not going to put it next to US 17. You're going to put it at the bottom portion of the hill, which is what we've identified for doing. So we're using gravity's effect on stormwater to get it where we want it, either as groundwater or as stormwater runoff. Okay. Now, as a part of any of these developments, and I apologize for switching back and forth, but we'll prepare a set of stormwater calculations. We've had the survey, we know what we're dealing with. And now we've got to go ahead and start doing some of the modeling we talked about to figure out how much stormwater runoff is going to occur versus the pre-existing conditions. So as part of our calculations, we generally put in a summary. We include some reference maps so that everybody knows the area that we're talking about, picture of the existing conditions. Tyler had mentioned, for example, soils maps. Overall, this is one of the things that we included in there so that you can see what kind of soils types are responsible. We include the floodplain as identified at that point in time. Again, you can kind of see kind of what I was speaking to a little bit earlier. That was the line that FEMA identifies. You can see it doesn't clearly match up with what the aerial has and what the actual existing condition was. They were just doing the best they had with what they got. So that would be some. All right. So the first thing we're going to look at is our pre-development. So we take a look at the existing condition and we take those contours that we saw on that previous and we'd identify our stormwater basins. All right. Stormwater basically runs perpendicular to our contour lines. That's the premise for figuring out where the water goes. So this was the high area over here at 17, going to Lake Gertie at the bottom area over here. You can see the water generally flows from east to west or right to left. There was, prior to the Hampton Inn going in, if you've been here for a while, I couldn't remember what it was. Storm's been here forever. So Storm reminded me that this was a bank, but there was a bank on the property with this initial driveway for access. As a part of their development, they had cut in this small stormwater pond where the water would overflow from the bank site via a ditch down to this stormwater pond. So you can see this is the basin delineation. This was, in point of fact, its own sub-basin. All the water that fell in this area made its way to this. Then after that, if it would discharge or get high enough to discharge, it would overflow into Lake Gertie. If it didn't, it would percolate into the ground and the groundwater would move down to Lake Gertie. But we want to make sure that we're accounting for what the existing condition was. That's why we go ahead and spell that out and identify that as its own separate basin. But you can see on the north side and the south side, those are still Basin B, and ultimately making their way down to the Lake Gertie Basin. So we talked about curve numbers before. We take a look at what the curve numbers are. This is the first basin. So we look at Basin A. We determine how much of surface was impervious versus naturally existing. We'd go ahead and identify those and move on. In this case, we had the benefit of the stormwater calculations that were prepared by the previous engineer. Reviewed them, didn't see any problems with it. He'd assigned a curve number of 51. And when you look at the bank size versus that entire basin, you go, yeah, that's probably not too bad a number overall. Yes, this is a lot of impervious, but when you compare it to the overall basin amount, it's not that high a percentage. And that's what you're doing is basically you're doing a prorated number. So when you get into Basin B, there were two different types. Had some that were A soils. Go back up here to this. So 4 is Astatula, which is an A soil. Then you had 61, which was a BD soils. So you take the worst case scenario. So you're talking about a D. So that's why when you take a look at how we're prorating the curve number, we've got one number that's good and one number that's bad. Make that determination on the amount of area, you calculate that, multiply it out, come to an average. And that's what you end up with for your stormwater model for your curve number overall. So, and again, it's a low number, so it means it's soaking a lot of that water in overall. So we've got to maintain that. Then one of the things we'll do is because there is a depression, or in this case, actually a pond, we just consider it a depression in the precondition, but we have to model that. We can't just assume or ignore that portion of it. It is holding water. It's impounding that aspect of it. So we've got to make sure that we model that in the system overall. So we take that survey information, we figure out what the volumes are based on the elevation that the water would rise to, put all of this into a fancy little computer program, and it tells us what our volume and what our rates are overall. Then we do basically that same thing with the post-development basin. We'll put down the different improvements that we're putting in. And then, so for example, you remember up here, this was part of B. We're not touching anything over here. We're not impeding that. That still flows. So we're trying to make sure that that stays out. We don't really want to bring that into our system. We don't want to have to treat that or do anything along those lines. It's naturally existing, so we want it to stay that way to mimic the existing condition as much as possible. Top of that, we bring it in, it does increase the size of the stormwater pond more than would be necessary. So we'd separate that section out, which becomes basin 2, and then we got basin 1, which now is the area that we've made changes to. And again, we're going back through determining the area of the bank site, the hotel, pool, sidewalk, parking areas, coming up with that total volume or total area. Then again, because like we said, once water falls in an area in a retention pond or a wetland, once water hits water, it all runs off. So we consider all of that area impervious surface, even though that first rain portion of it is going to immediately soak in and be ground. And it's a safer factor that we apply in there. Overall, if we take all of those and then we prorate them so that we figure out what our curve number is in that post condition. We basically put in our pond as the depression now, run all of that to figure out what amount of discharge we're going to have at that point in time. We know to size the pond for that volume, so we don't have to worry about that aspect when we specifically model. We're just worried about the rate. Now, one of the things we also take a look at, we talked about a little bit, was treatment. Obviously have to treat everything. This is the criteria that the Water Management District basically uses or used at the time. Let me put it that way. There were two different categories that you looked at: the amount of impervious or versus the overall basin. If it 1.25 inches over that was greater than 1 inch over the entire area, whichever number was greater. That's what you used for your volume necessary to be retained in your stormwater pond. So when we calculate the volume in our stormwater pond, we put in that factor as well as what we got from our model to identify our discharge control structure. Get into all the science. That in itself is probably more sciencey than it needs to be, but we use that model to predict all of that. So this is the input. As part of the calculations, you always give the input because unscrupulous like type people can go ahead and make changes in there and not publicize it. You want to make sure that you have all your criteria that you've used for identifying and running your model, so that if there are any errors or anything needs to be questioned, it's all there. And then you go back to this lovely little printout at the end. And this is where you're ultimately making the comparison between the different rates. So depression A, its discharge, and then 98W. And I won't get into what the terms mean, but 98W is basically Lake Gertie in the pre-condition overall. So you're looking at what discharge to that. And the depression A was discharging 12.6. Pardon me, I got it backwards. It was discharging 16, and in the post condition, we're discharging 2. So you can see that we're not discharging very much water at all. So that's what your goal would be overall with your system, and that's the requirement you have to meet to get your system in place. Now, there are different things that you look at outside of your calculations. The numbers are great, that's important. But when you go to your plan, one of the things that we mentioned earlier was, where do we put the pond? We put it at the low spot. Okay, and when you've got a slope like this one, and this is not the regular condition as we talked about, basically on a hill. So we've built up this downstream side, this being west, the right being north. we've rotated 90 degrees, but you've got a situation where you're building up on a hill, and now you've got the possibility where this area may have percolation and actually cause you a problem. So any of the stormwater ponds that get built on hills, one of the best things you can do is make sure that the water percolates through. It's not blowing that side out, and then you lose your stormwater pond. Remember back, I think it was during the 2005 hurricanes on the west side of town, on the Cascades over there off of 15A. The new section has a pond at the top of the hill, and it had that same exact condition where there was a lot of water coming through, much more than any of the design storms had, and it blew out that side, and all that water ended up in the depression to the south, that sinkhole down there, which is a problem. So we designed this, one of the things that we put in there just to make sure even though we're not really causing much of a bump, that amount of water moving this way is different than what it typically is used to. So we went ahead and had them put in what we call a clay core, which is basically just a line of clay. Remember, clay doesn't percolate very well. It does percolate, but it doesn't percolate very well. And basically what that does is that cuts off that flow of water in that particular direction. Now, it doesn't stop it. Clay core, the water will still go underneath or around, as well as a small amount through. But what that does is that keeps that ability for that water to get, during a large storm, to find a weak point and blow through that and create a catastrophic situation where you're discharging to the Lake Gerty Basin. So, which you don't want. So, appreciate everybody staying awake for that part. Bye. Nope. No, never had a problem with it. Yeah, this was built in 2014 and hasn't had much of an issue. Now, the benefit it has at this point is that at this point, the only thing that's actually been built is the hotel. So it's the only thing utilizing this pond. So the pond is designed to be able to take the culvert and this particular lot, not this one. But because there's nothing else coming in that space, the pond is a little bit over designed at this point. So, well, I'd love to say that, oh, my ponds never overflow, and they haven't yet, but that's not why in this case. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, everything on that side, sorry. Everything ancillary to that use. Sure.
How do you envision that system working there? Or are they going to, I don't know if Hampton owns that, or are they going to utilize that same retention area, or are they going to have a separate retention area?
I haven't actually looked at their particular site plan overall to know exactly what they're doing. When we do a subdivision like this, and this, people think of subdivisions, they think homes. It's not, it's a division of property overall. This is a commercial subdivision and created lots 1, 3, and 4 to be built on in the future. We do design the pond to account for certain parcels. Like I said, 1 and 3 are both included in this one, but we assume a certain amount of impervious surface. So, and that's generally how we do it with our residential subdivisions as well. And, as long as they're not exceeding that percentage, and I don't remember what the hell we'd assumed, whether it was 60% or 25% or not 100%. It wasn't 100%. If it exceeds that percentage, then they would need to do something on their side, or they could potentially come back and modify the pond. You can see there's an area over here that we left so that the natural flow of this section was not disturbed. They could also increase it in this direction, or they can go ahead and do something on their particular site overall. So there's different options, but yeah. Yeah, sure.
Throughout this process, or is there any consideration to what the ponds are doing to the surrounding groundwater and how that may affect other properties? Because in recent years, I've had people within the county come to me about stormwater ponds being installed near their property.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, the thought is that stormwater pond or those ponds around them have raised the water table because of various pumps or what have you there. So just
Right.
trying to get some insight.
Well, that's actually one of the things that that we've identified as a potential correction that can be made to the requirements for the stormwater rules. Right now, the stormwater rules just take a look at the volumes and the rates. They don't really specifically look at where a pond may be located. So for example, in this particular, one of the things that would be bad about this design, okay, as far as the effect on the surrounding properties, would be that, because this is a pretty good hill, this is the only place it makes sense to do a stormwater system.
Yeah.
We've now taken water that would have percolated over this site, again, turn it into runoff, which is a faster moving, and put it here. Now we returned it basically back to groundwater condition, but we've also short circuited this distance from, the farthest reaches over here to here, and we've given it a shortcut. So there is the potential that, yes, we've created more groundwater conditions sooner. It's the same amount of water.
Yeah.
Okay, again, it's a closed basin. The water is not going anywhere but to Lake Gertie. It's just the speed at which it gets there. In this case, we have shortened that speed or increased that speed, so to speak, overall. That said, the clay liner, the other aspect of it, does act as a barrier and slow it back down.
Okay.
Now, we didn't do any modeling in this case to determine whether or not it was the appropriate amount of slowing it down or not.
Yeah.
We were just busy patting ourselves on the back for not creating a catastrophic condition. So, yeah, go ahead.
Since you come over to the local government side, being primarily a design professional engineer now, you see problems, have to solve them,
Mhm.
manage capital projects. Do you, this is a really gross generalization question, but do you see any kind of consistency in why a drainage, whether it's a project or just the drainage design doesn't work?
Well, I would say that there are different reasons designs don't work. That said, I wouldn't say it was because I had moved over to this aspect. Sure.
Someone else who is a PE, who when they went to a different side, all of a sudden saw lots of problems
Well,
that had to be solved.
yeah, what I'll say is I think more about the rules in certain ways than I did before. I mean, obviously, when you're being paid by a developer or somebody, developer is a big word. I mean, a lot of the clients I had were small mom and pop type people overall. So, but you're just thinking about what is the most efficient way to meet the rules and get it done. Now, I will say that I always thought I performed rather ethically and tried to consider all the different things that would occur. But at the same time, I didn't spend as much time on that as I was, look, I need to get this done and figure out what are the different things. I do have a lot of faith in the rules as they are now. Are they complete? No. That's what we're trying to address as a part of this. And I'll be bringing forward some of our suggestions as we talk about the rules a little bit on different gaps. And along those lines, the things that I think of are, well, I'll say by going to government, I have access to more situations than I had on the private side overall. So we do see a lot more along those lines, and you get a chance to see what other engineers do and how they've reacted to different things or did not react to certain things. So yes, there is that aspect of it, but sorry. But No, it's a,
When there is something that's not working correctly, you don't see necessarily a consistent reason for why.
yes, I would say I see more individual reasons why something didn't work, something an engineer didn't consider overall. There are some gaps in the rules, as I said, that again, I didn't spend that much time thinking about when I was in the private side versus now. I mean, some things just don't become obvious or evident. I'd say that, you know, we looked at the rainfall patterns, for example, for DeLand overall. And that's a pretty big change. When you start going from extremes to a more even number, the fact that that even number is higher than the average was before, that's the bigger problem. And then you start figuring how do we solve that? How do we account for that aspect of it? Kind of ties in with what Alex was going along with regard to, you know, do these storms change? Do we need to take a look at changing these aspects of it based on the overall conditions? And you start to see things like that, you say yes. So you see more of those types of things overall, not necessarily as many patterns. It's still tough to see patterns until you really dig into them and go looking for them, like an effort like this creates. So, yes, Tyler.
I was gonna say, I think for the large part where I would have trouble with the question that you're asking, Tad, there's that we don't see a lot of examples of failed engineering. We see a lot of examples of the engineering met all of the standards and either the standards were insufficient or like if we look at Crystal Cove DeLand, the subdivision that went underwater, they permitted 1,500 square foot houses with whatever impervious coverage, and then everybody got a pool and a bunch of other stuff, and they doubled the impervious coverage. And I mean, on top of it, having traditional high water table in that area, I think that a lot of this is we built in areas before we had standards that today would require more modifications to build in. And how do we deal with this existing problem and not make it worse with what we do adjacent to it and things of that nature? But I think usually it's omissions or large errors that would be the engineering failures that you're going to see on the specific cases. And I mean, of course, there's design differences and tweaks that we as engineers learn, you know, at the beginning of our career. We don't really know all the art that we have at the end of a career, and you learn from your mistakes, but those are usually maintenance mistakes. When I worked at DOT, there's a lot of outfall systems and structures, and an overflow weir on a berm is a great way for us to get water out of a pond. DOT doesn't allow that anymore because they don't go check those weirs often enough, and they were failing and having pond failures and other things. And so it's, as a maintenance decision, there are some different designs that we work with as well, but that's again not really going into the modeling or the things that cause the flooding as much.
That's kind of why we're here, though, is to look at those standards and and update them. So that's a great real world example. Jessica has a question, but I have a question too first. Do you have anything more that you're going to share with us today?
No, I'm letting you off the hook.
Wow. Okay. So it is raining and it is 3:10. I have a couple of announcements and we may have other questions, but it looks like class might get dismissed early today, depending upon the question that Jessica wants to ask.
Me and Tad could talk for hours. I'm glad we brought up maintenance. I wanted to see, and it might build in more on the next kind of discussions in terms of state rules. I'll preface this by saying there's a lot of discussion in the community now regarding Hurricane Ian and Nicole, and there is the statement to be made that no communities plan for natural disasters. And so you have to choose a reasonable basis to measure for based on data. And so part of the discussion and kind of information I'm hoping we can look at is what does it look like if we see suggestions from different groups that the 25-year isn't enough, we need to use the 100-year, or we need to use the 150. Is there anything out there that shows jumping from 25 to 100 has this much change in terms of volume or area on a site that's needed? or additional costs or anything like that. And the second part of that is as it goes to maintenance, when you're designing these, you're contemplating a functional system. If you have places where it pops off and goes down different canal systems, does the modeling build in, say, during a storm event on the coast? So let's take East Volusia, the Halifax River, back flooding into the canal system while you're going out with your flow. Like, is that all contemplated?
I'll tackle the second part because you asked, that's the part I remember. When we model, again, what we're taking a look at is for a system like that on the ocean or on the river immediately adjacent to the ocean, we're taking a look at the tailwater condition, and is what we call that. And we're taking a look at the seasonal conditions on that. As you noted, the designs are not anticipating a 100-year storm and functioning during that because for the most part, nothing does. I mean, that's the whole idea behind it. You're going to have flooding to a certain level, and flooding sounds like a bad word, but if after it rains you've got water in your yard, that's not flooding. People call it flooding, but that's not flooding. I mean, and as far as the county and most of the state agencies, what we're looking at is water in homes, which is part of the reason. And we went through the discussion on the design, what those elevations get set at. Those are all things trying to design to make sure that doesn't occur on the new developments. But no, we don't. There's nothing to take into account, whether it was, I can't remember, it was Ian or Nicole, where we had the King tide at the same time. And that's a vast majority of the reason that New Smyrna Beach had all those problems. I mean, there's no place for the water to go. In much the same situation, if you had enough sea level rise where it wasn't working, those are the areas that would get affected. So what was the first one? Oh, the maintenance. No, we're yeah, part of the reason we don't do that is because one, the system is already oversized to a certain extent anyway. There are already safety factors built in and every portion of it overall. So for example, if you get sediment or something in your pipes, assuming you've got a closed stormwater system with pipes, it's getting it from your subdivision road to your stormwater pond. If there was something in there, one, the expectation is those pipes are designed with a certain amount of velocity so that you get scour. So that pushes whatever may drop into that area, for example. As it relates to the stormwater ponds, part of the reason those are one of the popular choices for developers and engineers alike is they take almost no maintenance. Depending on which water management district you talk to, St. John's wants you to go out and mow your stormwater ponds. South Florida says, screw that. Those plants are soaking up the material and they're creating the chemistry that you want, but it just depends on where you are as to whether it's good or bad. As that relates to maintenance, the point is, if you don't maintain your stormwater pond, a vast majority of it is going to operate exactly as designed throughout anyway. The biggest concern you'd have in terms of maintenance would be your discharge control structure overall. One of the things that was changed quite some time ago was the requirement for HOAs. And part of the reason that HOAs are important at new subdivisions is because now you have an entity responsible for going out there and accounting for that instead of just everybody pointing their finger at somebody else to do it. So no, for all those reasons, no, we don't bother to put in a maintenance factor overall. Bill?
So that what caught my attention from her question was, what would be the difference if you designed instead of the 25-year, 24-hour storm event to the something else, 100-year or whatever? Would it be 4 times as much, or would it be 5% more? Kind of.
No, I mean, if you recall, for example, from I know it wasn't up there very long, but the differences in the open basin and the closed basin, there were 2 different storms you looked at. The 24-hour storm in the open basin condition was 8 inches, if I recall right. And then the 2596 was 11 inches. Okay. That's sounds like a lot, but it's not really a lot. 100-year 24-hour storm, for example, is 11.3 inches. So they're right around that same level overall. So, if you change it from 100 year or 25-year storm to a 100-year storm, no, you're not going to double or triple the size of your pond. I don't know exactly what the percentage would be. There are too many other factors. If you got large lots, small lots, how much impervious surface you have versus it, that would play into how much runoff volume you've got to retain. But no, I'd probably say that you're looking at about 1.5 times if you go from a 25, 24 to 100 would probably be my guess, but it would be a guess.
On this side, we have some questions too.
Sorry, John?
John, Suzanne, and Tyler.
And it's the same one the government follows too, but yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I guess my question would be, I didn't turn it back on. I guess my question would be, how do you utilize the stormwater fees? And whether it's administratively or to correct errors or those kind of things, and explaining that public side that you have to deal with as well. And I know a lot of that's probably road and bridge,
Mhm.
but at the same time, it's all interconnected.
Sure. Yeah. As you said, my group does not oversee the stormwater portion of it, so I'm going to make some shit up and hopefully it sounds good. So, no, actually, they just had a big discussion on it at county council yesterday. So, your fee will be going up. But what the stormwater fee is used for, one is for studying the existing stormwater basins that we do have. Not the small ones like the Hampton Inn, not that aspect of it, but the much larger areas like Little Hawk Creek and those of that size. So what they'll do is one, they've got to study them. Some of them they have studied. I don't know which ones. That's more than I know, but they've got some studies. They're going to do some more studies overall, and then from those they'll identify capital projects. So, for example, if you've got flooding in a closed basin, they would try to look at what could we do to move the water out of this basin into an open basin to alleviate flooding. That would be what they try to identify. The other portion of it, too, with the stormwater utility is water treatment. So, for example, we've got the Indian River Basin, which has issues with pollutant loading and those types of things. So they will use a portion of that to go identify projects to try to remove those particular pollutants over on a large scale. Again, not trying to save some commercial developer a few bucks. It's really trying to go back to those areas that are already built out and try to rectify the situations there. I could not tell you what the percentage breakdown is. I do know that from what I recall, they were discussing yesterday, they're going to jump right into 2 studies as soon as possible and then start identifying projects from those. So did that get both parts? I couldn't remember which other. Okay.
So you almost answered pretty much. I was going to ask you about item 10 yesterday, and that's what you were just covering.
Mhm.
I wanted to know if you knew what the 2 studies were that you just said.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay, and what was the price that they raised it? It was
I think
$650
it went
to,
$8.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I actually wasn't in the room. That was what I heard, but yeah.
And the study that was, it was 500 pages plus 514. Do you know what basins were studied? I was just curious.
Again, I don't know the details on that. We can find out and we'll send an email out to the group though. Did you get what she was asking? Okay.
Guess I should unmute my microphone. On the rate item and volume item, one of the things that I want to point out is we're looking at differential rates and differential volumes. So when we increase our storm event, and especially in an area that's got poor soils or really high water tables, and what curve number is actually scientifically in the math, I appreciate that Tad didn't try to get into all the details, but it's a measure of soil storage. And there's a lot of formulas behind it. So when we get to those soils that have poor storage capabilities, the differential volume change from going from a 25-year storm to a 500-year storm isn't as big as the volume change in the storm, because our pre-development runoff goes off the charts as well. And when we start getting into some of these longer duration storms, which DOT runs 50 storms. Some agencies we design 3, some agencies we have to design all the way up to the 50 storm matrix. Those 50 storms rarely are harder for us to make work than the 3 or 4 select design storms that agencies choose. They just cover every possible situation because DOT really doesn't want their roads to have flooding or other issues. It's a conservative approach that they're taking because of the level of facility that it is. So as we start talking about these things, the hydrologic soil group that we're dealing with, that A, B, C, or D, the ground cover type that we're dealing with, the actual components of that pre-post model are really, that's the nuts and bolts of what we're dealing with, more than the storm event on making our stuff work. I mean, more water is more water, and it gets more challenging for us in some ways, but it doesn't just automatically mean that when we go to a bigger storm, that it's going to drastically change what we're doing.
So Tyler, you just went through a lot of technical stuff about FDOT, but everything you just said, can we sort of like hold on to that? And when we, 1 month or 2 months from now, really start looking at new language for revisions of ordinance, is there some useful stuff in the FDOT standards that we can reach into?
I don't think so for what we're dealing with. The way that the county approaches stormwater there, and I know that Tad's going to get into this more in the next discussion, but there are some conservative elements of the existing code versus the state code. And it's done in a way that it simplifies it to where there's less games that we can play in our software the county would have to look for. And I don't think it's a bad approach that's been taken in the past. DOT takes a complicating approach to things, and it's a lot more expensive, but they're doing it for their own facilities that are bigger and that we spend millions of dollars engineering instead of individual sites. So I think there's things that would be educational, but not necessarily that translate perfectly across.
Okay, maybe we can come back to it.
Will we next time hear about beyond open basin, closed basin, certain areas or certain discharge patterns that require increased review?
Well, next one, we're going to cover what the rules require, both ourselves and at the state. So any of those aspects covered in the rules will be identified. Yes. Go ahead, Bill.
And then the third time, you're going to come back with recommendations for changes.
If we don't get to it next time, yes.
An additional question. That's a great segue into several topics that still have to be covered. You'll recall that in our last meeting, we decided not to come back to the tree ordinance, our favorite thing, because Keith is not here today because he's out finding those examples of how other jurisdictions have dealt with some of the issues that we have before us. And because stormwater is a learning curve for us, we've presumed, how did you put it, Sarah Lee? None of us were geotechnologists. No, that we would start our learning about stormwater. So I didn't ask, maybe Sam knows, if our next meeting, so that we can begin preparing ourselves, if we're going to be looking at trees or looking at continuing education on stormwater.
From what I'm aware is that we are going to continue on stormwater for the next 2 months.
Okay, perfect.
And we may on that second month have an LID discussion as well.
Okay, great. And that, of course, dovetails with our instructions from council as well to be dealing with this. Thank you. So the next thing, and I don't know if Chris, who's over in the corner talking, knows the answer to this, or not, we still have to give our annual report and our work plan to the county council at some point.
We do, yes.
And I know that many of us would like to be present for that. Do we have any?
I'll give you
inkling?
warning for sure. It won't be on the 16th agenda, but it may be on the first meeting in May.
Mhm.
I got to confirm with county management though, so I'll get back with you.
Thank you. And then the third thing that I have is a very, and it comes from Clay Irvin and from me, but a big request that you consider attending the workshop on April 30th, which will deal with permitting and zoning. It will be here again, April 30th at 3 p.m. in council chambers. And it would be great if we could be there and listening. Yes, it is a council workshop. Zoning and permitting. It'll be relevant to our discussions at minimum tangentially. And I don't know if anybody is interested in this, but yesterday the Volusia Economic Development Group sent out an email that had links to maps that I don't know that they're that new for the county, but they were presenting them as new with layers, GIS stuff you can play with, but with the future land use and with all the zonings on them, which was kind of fun to play around with and look at, and will be relevant maybe to that meeting. So that's it for my examples, for my announcements rather. Anybody have, Bob, you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to like the big overriding issue I've been campaigning on all the way through trees, and it applies to engineering. I speak for myself here, and I think, there's agreement in the industry that we would rather see slightly more stringent regulations, provided navigating the maze of getting our permits was made simpler. That, we talked about that ad nauseum on the trees, is ways to get to that goal that are easier, quicker, easier on staff. So anyway, to apply the same philosophy here on stormwater, if there are ways to make it easier to get to that goal, if we have to make it a little more, the regulations a little more stringent to make them easier, I think there would be a lot of buy-in.
I want to jump in for that for just a second, Jack, and then that's something that I think that the whole group has embraced, is how do we make things simpler for the public to understand? The LID manual will eventually be really interesting to look at it, because I'm thinking of it as one-stop shopping. But I have no idea personally how we would do that. I really don't know. And so, we can just keep our, we'll just put Sam on it. Like you mean you. And I'm not even sure
We
that,
need to put a hold on all of Bob's permits.
I'm not even sure it's something that. We've nibbled at the edges of it. So a lot of the things that we approved were fixing discrepancies and making language a little more understandable. But I don't know. And now I'll let Jack talk, because he usually makes a lot of sense.
No, I don't know. But this workshop that they're talking about is to drive efficiencies. That's one of the things that the points they made. So perhaps that's to some extent what they're trying to get to. The workshop may actually be in that direction. But my question is about the workshop and what is our level of participation? I mean, in the workshop, who's talking to who, and we're attending. So I was just wondering how we fit in the workshop.
Typically, all we can do is listen. There's usually not a public comments period or a discussion with the public, but I have the ones I've attended on topics, obviously, that I was interested in. I have always come away glad that I was in the room.
Yes, to Jack. That was the reason I actually, the council said yesterday in closing comments that there are going to be no public comments, that's their time to work because of sunshine law, they don't get to talk about these things, so they plan to discuss them there and they're not allowing public comment. Now, with that being said, I just want to say that part of the reason this workshop came about in the first place was because of what is going on with the fuel terminal in Ormond Beach right now and the industrial 2 zoning, the I2 zoning. And that is going to be discussed there, to my understanding. So if you have anything to say prior to the workshop with comments, you might want to go to the meeting on the 16th and say them then. So just putting that out there.
Okay, if there's nothing else, do we need a motion to adjourn? No, we don't need a motion to adjourn. Get to your cars before the rain starts coming down again. Thank you very much, everybody. Look forward to seeing you next month.